let's work our way in if we can. Just a little, maybe? Maybe a little? Is that okay? Can you hear that? That sounds good. That sounds good. Well, I suspect we'll be thin today. We'll be thin with the snow, right? Oh, wait a minute. You thought I was talking diet, didn't you? Okay. No, I wasn't talking diet. Funny. Last week when we were looking into the things about Carl Ketcherside and Leroy Garrett and the influence and the change that they had. In regards to that, I want to make a little comment. And part of this has to go with something that Joe said weeks ago, maybe maybe months ago. And it was this. I was over and I went and saw Levada Jones yesterday.
Oh, good.
And so I'd been there a while, and so I went over and got to talk. I think we talked 4 hours. It just melted away. But anyhow, so as we were talking, I was telling her about the class because when I last seen her, I talked about some of the things that we've more recently gone over, but that was back then. And so we're talking about all that and so on. So I was talking to her about Carl Ketcherside. Well, I got the look. And because and the point I'm making is this, is that her experiences, if you will, were before he changed. And so he's the guy that was blowing up all the churches, splitting all the churches and things like that, which he was doing in those earlier times. And so I got a chance to talk with her about that. And the point being is something you said, Joe, was that some of the things we've talked about, you said those weren't our experiences. We weren't even aware of that. Well, and this is 60-something years ago where these changed. So just, it happens as we go and as we people. And so as we were ending up last time, we were talking about our schools and this progressive, for want of a better term, movement, Church of Christ, could not have risen apart from our colleges and universities. But it's very interesting that our colleges and universities were kind of started to be able to cement our understanding of things and to, ingrain that and so on and so forth in the students. And so as we ended on this last time. This was what is now Lipscomb, and that was the old Nashville Bible School in the late 1800s. Scotty? Anybody know? I don't know. It's on? Yeah, it should be. It was working earlier.
I didn't touch it. Do you have a touch screen when you go?
No. I can't reach that high. Just a moment, I'm sorry.
There it is.
That's a lot of push button. Okay. Now, once established, however, our schools effectively promoted genuine education rather than just our interpretation or understandings of Scripture. The colleges inevitably moved our fellowship beyond insular concerns and into a larger world of ideas as it graduated students who served in urban centers as teachers, bankers, attorneys, corporate executives, and having engaged the larger world in this fashion, it was inevitable that some of the churches of Christ would grapple with the ethical and intellectual concerns that were rising up in the 60s everywhere, and to seek ways to promote a larger ethical theological vision in our fellowship. And of course, what does that mean? What are they trying to say? the idea was that when you're exposed, or excuse me, when you have a very narrow frame of reference, when you're only around people that just think like you do, or you know, you only read things by people you feel are safe to read from, because someone might have an idea that, you know, isn't what we hold to, or things like that. Well, you know, when you're exposed to other ideas, it expands your thinking, or at least you're aware of things. That doesn't mean that you necessarily change everything you thought, and so on and so forth, but you become certainly more aware of things. And so students were graduating, going out into public life, into the cities, you know, the suburban areas. Remember, our fellowship tended to be very rural overall, and that was, you know, changing. And so you get all these influences and experiences influencing people and what they think and what they understand. Well, in the 60s, with the civil rights issues, with the Vietnam War, with things such as that was a decade when there was a lot, as we've already mentioned, going on, a lot of questioning of things, and so we're seeing that happen. The progressive movement in the Churches of Christ was also shaped significantly by the graduate theological education that had begun in earnest in our fellowship in the 1950s. W.B. West, Jr. established the first graduate program in Bible and religion among Churches of Christ at Pepperdine in 1944. Now, why is this significant? Because, as we mentioned a little bit last week to review, that when, you know, you can't offer graduate programs, meaning masters, you can do your BA or BS or things like that, but you can't offer those unless you have teachers, professors, I'm going to term that have these higher doctoral degrees. Well, our colleges in the Churches of Christ were not equipped with that level of education degree at this time. And so W.B. West in our fellowships universities was the first to start a graduate program because he had a doctorate degree, I think, himself. And so that's what's going to be happening in the 50s and then on into the 60s and so on. And so our people, if you want to call it that, had to go to other groups, universities who were accredited in that way to get their degrees. And that's why, like, I mean, obviously this wasn't the 50s, but, you know, Jerry went to, was it Southeast Baptist, where he got his doctorate? I think that might be somewhat in the spring.
Same process, they were struggling.
In that process. And
Or
so,
they needed him to have a PhD, so
yes.
they supported him to go down there and get it.
And so that allowed him to do more harding.
Right.
And things, and so there's an example of what this is happening.
Same
So-
thing happened at Ohio Valley with my brother-in-law.
Yes.
He had to get his doctorate in order to, for the school to give the
Yes.
accreditation.
And so it's a process. And so that's why it's happening, because we couldn't give those kind of degrees at that time. And so then in 1952, West led the founding of a similar program at Harding, and by 1958, that program occupied its own separate campus in Memphis, and that was the Harding Graduate School of Bible and Religion. And in 1953, Abilene launched a comparable program offering a master's degree in Bible Studies. Now, probably most of you know this, or some of you do. Harding Graduate School of Theology in Memphis closed last year. I think in the spring or something. And they had
They sold
moved.
the campus since then.
The campus closed. And they moved it to the Harding proper, if you will, in Searcy. And so it'll continue soon. Now, these, you know, here we're talking about this time when this is all coming up. We're in a time now where a lot of it's going down. And I know, like at Oklahoma Christian, some of those graduate degrees are axing because they don't really have enough people taking them to justify the expense of faculty and so on and so forth. So this is a little bit different time, but here's a time when it's all moving up. Now, in order to offer graduate programs in religion, as we said, these colleges had to secure significant numbers of professors with doctoral degrees in Bible and related studies. Of pivotal importance in this regard was Lemoyne G. Lewis, who, after earning a doctorate degree from Harvard, returned to his alma mater, Abilene Christian, as a professor of church history in 1949, and he continued to serve there until 1986. Lewis successfully encouraged scores of his students over the years to pursue doctoral studies in religion at Harvard and similar institutions. Now, just a little side note. I was talking to Melinda Weaver, his father, when they were moving in, and he's a graduate of Abilene, and he's a minister down there in San Antonio too. But anyhow, he said that he took a class in Abilene from Lemoyne Lewis right toward the end. He said, yeah, he was past his best days, is what he said. But on my site, I kind of thought that was interesting. Not that it means much, but it's kind of interesting. Now, by the mid-50s, Don Haynes, we'll see his picture in a minute, observed the first generation of Lemoyne's boys, as some people call them, arrived at Harvard. That was Everett Ferguson, Pat Harrell, and Abraham Mallaby. Others soon followed, including Roy Bowen Ward and Harold Forshey from Abilene, Thomas Ulbrich, and Don McGahee, who had done undergraduate studies at Harding. Now, you go, who are these names? Well, some of us have probably heard of Everett Ferguson, because he's done a lot of scholarly work, did a lot of scholarly work in early, those first centuries of Christianity. Like one of his books was Early Christians Speak, and I think it's a couple of other volumes. It was really well known, and it was read beyond our fellowship. He also did one on baptism in the early church. I think I mentioned this last week, that Gary Horn took a 900-page volume and condensed it into 10 pages and sent it to Norman and I to look at. But anyhow, so Everett Ferguson was very well known as a Bible scholar, as was Thomas Ulbrich, or those are his names that I know. And so they just continued to promote this high level of scholarship that is recognized by others in that field as to what they're doing. This was the beginning of a virtual host of aspiring scholars who would soon take up doctoral level studies at prestigious institutions of higher education throughout the United States and abroad. Some of these scholars took teaching posts at prestigious universities such as Yale, Harvard, Emory, Notre Dame, and others. Leroy Garrett taught some at Princeton, and so it was getting out into the other areas. As heirs to the anti-institutional and Summerite traditions, Ketcherside and Garrett had focused their work almost exclusively on questions of sectarianism and exclusiveness, and exclusivism. In other words, they're pointing out that this isn't the way to go. And that's what a lot of their whole mission was in that area. Well, this new generation of scholars that emerged in this tradition. And he made contributions both in Hellenistic and moral philosophy into the ways in which early Christians were influenced. In other words, he's digging in to the context in which our scriptures were written. And then it was a Hellenistic world. And what was Hellenism? That was the Greek culture that was spread and influenced throughout the whole world. And that had happened before, but a lot of it happened through Alexander the Great, because he conquered so much of stuff. And so his scholarship was saying, you know what? The writers of the New Testament, the disciples, even Jesus, was born into that culture that permeated, and thus it's important to realize that how they looked at things was probably influenced some by those things that are around them. Just like we as Americans look at things in some ways, and if you're in Africa or Europe, you might look at some scripture a little differently. And so that kind of thinking. Further, these scholarly questions were not addressed in traditional periodicals. In other words, the Gospel Advocate and the Affirmed Foundation weren't taking the deep dive into these topics. And to fill the vacuum, a new publishing venture emerged in our fellowship in 1957 called the Restoration Quarterly. Now, that's not the Restoration Review that Leroy Garrett published. This is something different. And as it was conceived by two of Lemoyne's boys, Mallerby and Harold, the founders set two goals for the quarterly: to create a community of scholarly discourse among religion scholars in the churches of Christ, and to enrich the theological agenda of churches of Christ with ideas being discovered and learned, and things that being discovered and learned, and things that may modify how we understand things at one time and then at another. And so that's what we have going on here. As it turned out, the Restoration Quarterly's interaction with what is called biblical criticism led to a serious critique of basically our hermeneutic, which was that Baconian rational way of looking at things we looked at very extensively, and traditional assumptions about the New Testament containing a blueprint for faith and worship. And so a bedrock part of the Restoration movement early on was the idea of here's the Bible, and some viewed it as almost a blueprint. In other words, God has told us what he wants, therefore we should do just that. And we also said that some viewed that as you can only do what God allowed you to do because he tells you so, or others viewed that as what God didn't say, there was a little more freedom. And so, but that's what this debate was. And so in the 60s, this debate really flourished. And so this is when a lot of change was going to be happening that many of you certainly lived through and experienced. Still, this Restoration Quarterly's new vision remained largely restricted to the scholarly community. In other words, it's still only reaching the few. It was not until the late 60s that this thinking and these understandings began disseminating the results, or scholars began disseminating these results of biblical and theological scholarship to a broader and largely lay audience. We would be considered a lay audience. And so it was getting out to more regular folk, if you will, instead of just those that are nerdy into all that kind of stuff. The two journals responsible for this dissemination of these scholarly things was one called Integrity. Has anybody here ever seen that? That was a journal that began in '69 as a regional publication in Michigan, but it quickly gained a national following and among the progressive wing of the church. And Mission magazine, have any of you heard of that one? I'd heard of that one and seen that. In 1967. Now, Mission became the chief symbol among those that were resisting a lot of this and viewed it as theological liberalism among the churches of Christ. Because remember, liberalism is something that's more one direction than I am, and so on, generally. So here's a copy of one of the issues of Integrity, and it was published until 2002. And it strove for unity among those who believe in the authority of the Bible. So they believe in the authority of the Bible, and provided a forum for discussion of current issues that trouble or plague the unity of the Restoration movement. The journal pages were a space where the sacred cows, if you will, of our fellowship could be questioned, challenged, rejected, and or accepted. In other words, it was a forum. They were talking about things that others thought you shouldn't talk about those. Why are you talking about that? And so on and so forth. Well, that's one thing that this magazine was for some. And there was many that embraced it. There was many that rejected it, but there was many that embraced it. Now, Mission magazine was published between 1967 and 1988. mission was a forum for theological reflection on issues such as race, gender, war, and peacemaking. So you got what? You got the civil rights, you have the women, issue with women, and you have the Vietnam War. And so there were those who felt those were very important topics, and here was a place where they could discuss theological understandings of these events that were going on, if you will, all around us. And the place of the church in urban society, the nature and the implications of restorationism and the critical biblical and historical scholarship. In other words, it was taking on a lot of things. And I think as we've known and talked about, people that grow up in the city generally view some things differently than those who grew up in the country. And as we said often, that divide is expressed in music, country music especially, and lots of things. And so it's just a different way of looking at things. And so that was part of this. And so when you see your world changing, and if you're a part of this world or that world, first of all, change can be very confusing. And you don't understand it, and so then you look to things and so on. Well, here finally was a forum where people could write in, discuss, and things like that. Now, Dwayne Evans was the young minister for the West Islip Church of Christ. That's located on Long Island, New York. And he provided the leadership that ultimately led to the creation of Mission Magazine. In the fall of that year, Evans invited 5 other men, his brother Ralph Evans, John Allen Chalk, who we've mentioned before, William Banowski, who would later become president of Pepperdine, I believe, Wesley Reagan, no relationship to Jill and Randy, and Walter Birch, who we've mentioned before, to meet with him in Midland, Texas, to discuss the need for a journal that would speak to contemporary man in vital, energetic language, and a message of renewal. Attendees of subsequent meetings agreed on the need for the journal to address, from a biblical point of view, the social and intellectual issues that were so affecting America at that time. So there were those yearning for it. We've already pointed out that some of our major publications kind of tended to ignore it. Didn't want to deal with it, too uncomfortable, agreed with it, whatever. And it really wasn't dealt with, and there was others. And who were a lot of those others? It was more the younger folk from that. And so a different set of understandings, just like we had a different set of views in our parents, and so on and so forth. It's always been that way. And so we see some of that. And so to dismiss or ignore those concerns was very frustrating for some. And so one participant in the Memphis meeting stated the case for Mission Magazine in unequivocal terms. No extant, no existing publication is speaking to our brotherhood in bold, fresh, and relevant terms. No periodical exists which deals with the most prominent issues of modern life. Many are hungry for such a publication. They are more concerned in searching than in perpetuating the illusion that we have utterly restored pure Christianity. And so there was those that said, hey, we've already restored it. What's the problem? And there were those that were saying, we've got to keep it just like it is. And we're going to talk about that group that was much that way. And there was others that said, hey, we're searching. Those answers are not satisfying that we've always been given. This made me think of the concept of new songs, new music. And it's interesting. I remember listening to the classical station years ago, and he used to have a saying on it that said, at one time, all music was new. And I think when I was in college, a youngster, and I'm being exposed to Sing and Be Happy, 728B, right? There is Beyond the Azure Blue. Well, at one time, those haven't existed since the time of Jesus or even the time of Alexander Campbell. that was newer stuff. And we all know those songs and love them because they're exciting and things like that. Well, you know, and so in a sense, that's kind of what this is satisfying, not in the musical sense, but in these theological questions. Walter Birch, who was one of the guys that was going around trying to raise funds to support this, because you got to have funds, from mainstream congregations, and he received little encouragement. He traveled from coast to coast to raise funds and secure support. Significantly, many scholars that were writing pieces for the Restoration Quarterly were involved in missions inception. They were supportive of that, hearing these ideas and getting these things out. So we see a list of those who have done that. The editors communicated the journal's aim in the first issue. It shall have three purposes. One, to explore thoroughly the scriptures and their meaning. So, what does that mean? And their meaning. What might be a single word that might describe what and their meaning means? Context. In other words, what did it mean to them? When they heard it, when Paul wrote this, what did the receivers of this, how did they understand that letter? And that's called context. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't make application at this end of things, but it's significant that we understand how did they understand? Because there's things, as we know in the scriptures, that go, we might go, huh? Because our time is not just like that, as far as whatever particular maybe is being described. And so it helps to understand. So it's a deep study into the scriptures and the context. Number two was to understand fully as possible the world in which the church lives and has her mission. That's referring to now. What does it mean now? And that's some of the things we've tried to broach on in here over time, that if we don't understand where we're living at here and now, and if we're just holding on to old ways of looking at things that make no sense to those we're trying to reach out to, and some would say that's part of the struggle that is going on across the board, is some of those things. But in other words, understanding the application now. And number three is to provide a vehicle for communicating the meaning of God's word to our world. So understanding our world and how they think. And number three is, how can we craft the message? Because what happened in the first century? A lot of them crafted the message to Greek culture. And then thinking, now, some would look later on and say, well, maybe they went a little too far with that, there's a little too much Plato here, or, so on and so forth. But nonetheless, because that was the way the culture understood the world and looked at it. And so how do we communicate what we know and understand of that? And so that's what the broad thing was, what this magazine was. From the beginning, Contributors to Mission aimed its message directly at the pulpit and the pew and sought to redirect the theological interests of churches of Christ away from what they viewed as provincial battles of the past toward what they viewed as more pressing ethical, biblical concerns inspired by the 60s. And what was that? Things of race, things of poverty, things of all that, things of the war, is this a just war, so on and so forth. And so that was a lot of it. However, a lot of the magazine didn't really deal a lot with the Vietnam War, as much as you might think. As Dwayne Evans later described, we were willing to tackle themes that no other brotherhood journal would touch. And why do you think they didn't touch it? Well, quite a lot of reasons. Some is they didn't think like that. But others thought, if we print that, we're going to lose our subscribers. And then we're going to go out of business. All these factors often work into it. More than this, they sought to make mission an open forum where voices from a variety of perspectives could be heard. A genuine alternative to what they viewed as the lockstep orthodoxy that had characterized the gospel advocate, and to a lesser degree, the firm foundation, meaning at least Rule Lemons would publish opposing letters. What do you mean by that? For these reasons, provided a unique window into a variety of concerns that divided our fellowship at the time, because it's dealing with those issues. Now, social justice, racial equality, and no more. Time and time again, Mission chided Churches of Christ for their failure to deal forthrightly with the issues of racial justice. John Jay suggested that no element in our nation or our world stands in a greater need of self-evaluation on this point than Churches of Christ. That was his view. Jennings Davis criticized the thoughtless gaze of Christians who condone the systematic terrorism and violence perpetrated against blacks in American culture. Thomas Langford suggested in the absence of serious leadership of the church, God had raised up Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King to provide examples in the realm of racial justice. In other words, Thomas Langford was willing even to suggest that if Christians aren't doing it, God's raising somebody else up who's going to take care of these, or deal with these problems, certainly much more than it's been.
When was that written?
In the 60s.
Okay, because to me, reading that today in our current structure has a totally different meaning. I mean, social justice today, I get it. I know what social justice is. And as I've mentioned before, I have a hard time understanding what all the rough is about in today's society. I mean, where else have we ever been that people have advanced in whatever race to where they are today?
And so Carl's point is, why are we still dealing with this? Didn't we advance beyond that?
I'm sure
it's different today than it was then.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are areas in society where we're still dealing with that old 40 years ago nonsense. Come on. Let's get rid of Jim Crow forever and forever and ever. That's silly. I don't like to have my person questioned, especially when I'm in a situation where I've already been credentialed. That's sad. And yet it goes on. And I don't like it when I go to the airport and I have to be patted down.
Sure.
Are you kidding me?
Well, as we said before,
Right.
these are very real things, and it gets emotional. It gets our emotions quickly.
Right. One more thing.
Okay.
In today's world, you can go to PBS and you can hear about these folks whining about how many people are in prison and all of this, and how the big percentage of people in prison are having to be a certain type of individual. Look, if you do the crime, you do the time. It should not be that social justice today means that you could just get off of the hook without being responsible for your behavior. That's what I meant earlier.
Sure.
This was written in a different time.
That's
Well,
applied social justice.
Some would question that assumption.
Well, I'm sure they would. Hey, they're entitled to their opinion.
But nonetheless, and so it's difficult.
Yes.
And so as all of us know, if we've ever been in an extremely painful, emotional something, relationship breakup, whatever, it's really hard to get over that. And so someone, said, why don't you just get over that? Well, in one sense, we understand that. In another sense, this doesn't want to follow along.
It's hard to move on when
It's
you've been
hard.
beaten down.
And so whether we agree with it or not, many of these things, for some, are still fueling a lot of the stuff we're seeing today. Whether they should or not is, that's open debate, things like that. But nonetheless. Mission was among the few periodicals serving Churches of Christ that reported on such events like the meeting in Atlanta, the racial conference where they're trying to deal with stuff there, and what Franklin Florence was doing in his protest up in Rochester, New York against Eastman Kodak. And so it's embracing these struggles from their point of view. Many mission writers, especially among the younger generation, complain that our fellowship showed vast concern for doctrinal orthodoxy but little concern for social ethics. In other words, you know, blowing a gasket if someone does something different on this particular, that particular, whatever, and we've already discussed a great amounts of those. And not paying attention to these things that are really affecting people is how they view that. These people concluded simply that Churches of Christ had majored in the minors, and you've probably heard that phrase before. In other words, we're making really important things that aren't that important. And instead of what are things that are more important. And again, sometimes how that's determined or decided can be very difficult at times on some of that. And so what happened for many in the Church of Christ, because if you read different things, there were a lot of people that started leaving in this time, mainly all the young people. It was because, as some have put out there, that message of focusing and preserving on these little finer points of doctrine, however important those may or may not be, that message became irrelevant to a significant number of people. They go, that isn't dealing with the problem. And so that's what that means. Dan Danner, a Church of Christ scholar who taught theology at the Roman Catholic University in Portland, you know, you go to where they'll hire you, lamented that many debates over such issues of how we can scripturally help an orphan or a widow, and we've talked about those, and many of you are very familiar with those and experienced those debates, over such issues, whatever we can to help the needy who are not in our fellowship from the church treasury, while children go uncared for and unfed. And so what was that debate? There was the anti-institutional wing, just to rephrase it real quickly, said that, you know what, in Corinthians, it was mainly Corinthians, I think, that it shows that money that was supposed to be collected was supposed to go to the Christians in Jerusalem. And so since that's the example we have, that's the only example God gave us, so that must be the one that we have to use, and we can't go beyond that. And so if we as a body, you can as an individual, but if we as a body gave money to the children's home, or to this, or to that, you can't do that. And so there are those that said, so you'd rather let them die and do nothing because you feel like it. And so that's what that argument is, just to refresh it. Now, Don Haynes, and again, usually when people are in these instrumental times, nobody takes pictures of them. And it's when they're older that you get the picture. So he's probably older here. Don Haynes, a young activist and scholar, concluded that the Church of Christ had managed to sidetrack the real issues in a desperate search for gnats to strain. And of course, referring to Jesus' comment on the Pharisees. By consistently looking to the pattern of the primitive church reflected in the book of Acts, instead of the example of Jesus revealed in the Gospels. Church of Christ had missed a central point, charged Haynes. And so that's going back to the great influence that Campbell had, where he divided, things up in a time. You had your kind of your Old Testament, and so and even the Gospels were not the New Testament, because the New Testament, after Jesus died and was resurrected, and the church started. And so, not that Campbell ignored those others, I'm not saying that, but a great focus on who are we to be was on Acts on. And so for some, they made that the priority, even if it contradicted what Jesus said, because that focus was such. And so that's kind of what he's addressing here. Is that? Then Haynes specifically addressed the problem of the 60s. The basic issue is whether we can do the gospel on Jesus' terms or whether we will serve God or mammon, and not, unfortunately, whether we sing without an instrument or say thee and thou in prayer or even baptize by immersion. So long as we harbor the illusion that God cares more about what transpires within the hollow walls of church buildings than about the sickening bloodshed of Vietnam or the struggle for freedom of men and women in chains and poverty, or the willful treachery of government bureaucracy, or even the routine of the offices, classrooms, farms, and factories, then we're kidding ourselves. Now, Haynes is not saying get rid of baptism and get rid of that, but he is pointing out there's those that focus so much on that you got to get that right. And it doesn't matter about these other things. And that's what he's critiquing, is that emphasis. Not that he's going and saying, be baptized and that's it. Gary Freeman, who took Church to Christ to task for our preoccupation with fine points of doctrine to the neglect of social justice, in 1969, Harper Row published Freeman's book that was called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Heaven. Did anybody read that or was aware of that?
No, but I remember what it was talking about.
Okay, it certainly talked about it, right? And some people probably wouldn't read it because they're afraid it would pollute them or influence them negatively. Lead them away from the Lord.
Basically, the conversation I heard was, don't read that.
Yes. and unfortunately, that's how we often dealt with lots of stuff on things that went challenge or question official understandings of things. But anyhow, so this was a book, and it's biting criticism, it's satire, it's those kind of things, which satirized Churches of Christ on this and a variety of issues. The book never mentions Churches of Christ by name, but it was based almost entirely on well-known figures in our fellowship and on incidences that actually occurred when the student, or when he was a student at Abilene. So he's basing this on things that he saw, experienced, etc. And the foibles at Lampoon's were universal enough to attract significant readership across a wide spectrum of American denominations. The book inflamed both the conservative and the mainstream churches. In other words, he really went at it, kind of like Adam Payne in our founding documents of our country. Some of those guys really went after it. And as we talked about in Alexander Campbell's Christian Baptist, I mean, there's the example for you. He went after the clergy, the this and that, all it was, and that attracted a lot of people. And then when he tried to backtrack, some people thought he went soft. Later on as we discussed. And so here's just an example of this was happening. What made this book even more significant was that soon after it appeared, Freeman began a regular column in Mission entitled Balaam's Friend. And of course, who was Balaam? That was the donkey, right?
Bad prophet.
Bad prophet. But the donkey, right?
No, it was the prophet
Okay.
that rode the donkey.
That's what it was, the road donkey.
Balaam's donkey.
And then he continued the exploits of Cletus, made up character to make his point, and held up to scathing ridicule what he and many readers in Mission viewed as a reluctance of Churches of Christ to come to terms with the pressing issues that they saw in the 60s. In one of those columns, Freeman juxtaposed the Churches of Christ's concern for doctrinal purity and a general failure to address the issue of racial justice. And in that connection, he satirized Will Lemon's claim that the racial prejudice among Churches of Christ was almost non-existent, that we mentioned a couple weeks ago in his view. And of course, there was many that would vehemently disagree with him. Further, mission writers typically had little patience with suburban congregations that had built elaborate and comfortable facilities in the post-war period to serve the essential middle class and suburban membership that had often turned a deaf ear to the problems of the inner city. We talked about that in some more sections. One writer stylized himself as Pseudo-Amos. And of course, pseudo, what he's playing on is if you look at ancient writings, there are ones that scholars have found that they may call pseudo and name a well-known prophet. In other words, they're not sure who wrote it, but it's claiming a title similar to that. So he's playing off that idea. Pseudo-Amos proclaimed the Lord's judgment on Churches of Christ for retreating from the inner cities to suburban sanctuaries. In other words, In other words, how many churches moved out of the cities is what they're complaining about to go into the safer suburbs. And, you know, church flight, if you will. And so we see the old abandoned structures downtown that were grand edifices at one time. Heated back
Church
between
flight
soft
followed
light.
white flight. That was,
What?
church flight followed white flight.
Yes,
When the
yes.
people moved out,
Yes.
the church had to go with them.
Yes.
True. Way stretch it, that's society as a
Yeah.
whole.
Yes. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And so anyhow, so there are these concerns. We gotta stop here. Even though we don't have a giant mass in the foyer today
We don't have.
because of the snow. But we have us.